So what I was thinking of doing was just to tell you a little bit about Reos in terms of professional background and what we do and so on briefly, and then telling you a little bit about my personal background and how I guess I ended up doing what I'm doing. And then maybe we can just have a bit of a conversation about what would be most helpful to talk about and hear from some of you, and then we can take it from there. Does that work? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so Reos is a relatively small and new organization. So we've been around for about 5 years. There was a predecessor firm, as Mary mentioned, called Genron, which was based in the US, that had been around for about 10 years, that I used to work for. So the way Reos is structured is we have local offices. So we have 7 local offices around the world. And they are in Oxford, 2 in the US, 1 in Brazil, 1 in South Africa, 1 in Australia, and 1 in the Netherlands. And basically the way we run is we have partners who run each of the offices. So we have about 17 partners who run these offices. And basically the work we do is essentially we come up with, we try and implement strategy, if you like, around what we call complex social challenges. And that can range from, it ranges extremely broadly. So some of the things Mary mentioned, so we work in post-conflict situations, we work on food and agricultural issues, we work on sustainability issues, we work on climate change, we work on energy issues. And I guess what all of those things have in common are that there are groups of people who are working on those issues or who are stakeholders with those issues that really can't agree on what to do. And typically what happens is that we get asked to come in quite late. so you know, we've tried A, we've tried B, we've tried C, it hasn't worked, you know, can you come and help us? Our response in almost 100% of those cases is to actually bring together groups of stakeholders, so as diverse as we can get, and actually get them to come up with solutions and responses and implement those solutions and responses. So we don't come up with strategies or ideas for what to do. What we do is we bring diverse groups of people together and essentially work with them to actually implement what they think is needed in the situation. That presents a couple of challenges. So obviously if you bring together people who are really, really diverse and different from each other, they speak different languages, they believe different things, and they want to do different things. So getting those groups of people to actually do something together constructively is essentially what we do. And the idea is that what we try and do is we try and get people to act in situations of complexity where it's really not obvious what to do, where there's vast disagreements on what to do. And the question is, how do you not get stuck in debate or dialogue or conflict or whatever it is, and actually get to the implementation and to doing things on the ground. So a lot of what we do is around getting the preconditions in place for action. So before you act, what is it that you need to put in place in order to act? And often what happens is we get people coming to us saying, okay, we want to do X or we want to do Y, and the preconditions really aren't in place for action. So I would say that 50% of what we do or 60% of what we do is getting those preconditions in place. And once they're in place, actually doing things becomes a lot easier and a lot more possible, and requires a lot less support from people like us. In terms of working with groups, I mean, one of the challenges with diverse groups, as I said, is that you have this diversity of positions, but you also obviously have real conflicts within the group where you have people who have different positions, and I'm sure you're all familiar with this. So over the last, I guess, 10 or 15 years, we've developed a whole set of processes and approaches and tools in terms of how we get people to work together and people to act. And I guess that's kind of where our expertise, in quotes, comes in. And what we found, I guess, over the last 15 years is that, you know, as we work with groups, we find we actually don't have certain skill sets or we don't know how to deal with certain things. So we've shamelessly stolen, borrowed, done whatever it's taken to, you know, bring in the skill sets that we need. Either we go out and learn them ourselves or we bring them in. And I guess over the last 15 years, we found that we often don't have the skill sets to you know, complete, if you like, the work. And the answer that we always come back to is that, you know, there are people out there who have the skill sets, who have the understanding, and you just need to bring them in the room. And if you get enough of those people in the room, then really the assumption we start with is that the answer's in the room and the solutions are in the room, but it's a matter of kind of discerning them and seeing them. And obviously that's very, very hard, because you have a lot of noise and you have a lot of, you know, there's a lot of noise that prevents you from seeing people. So a lot of what we do is around perception of what's already there. So how do you see what's already there rather than see what you want to see? Or so our starting point is always, you know, we talk about starting with current reality. Whether we like it or not is irrelevant to a certain extent. So that's just some of the background in terms of Reos. In terms of stuff that we're working on, just to kind of give you a couple of examples of what we're working on, we're trying to get a initiative on community resilience off the ground, a UK-wide effort on community resilience. And the idea is that communities across the UK are subject to quite predictable shocks, so public service cuts, you know, weather events, and you know, we all know that they're coming. And rather than wait for them to kind of come and then figure out what we're going to do once our communities have kind of suffered these things, the question we're asking is what can be done proactively to really practically increase the resilience of communities around the UK to very predictable shocks, if you like. And how can that be done in a way where communities self-organize in response to these kind of shocks? So we've been working on that for about a year. And the challenge obviously is what can you practically do in terms of, you know, organizing communities and helping communities to do what they want to do. I do a lot of international work, so most of our work, my work anyways, probably about 70% of it is overseas and abroad. So for example, I just came back from New York, where we ran a session that was hosted by the Liberian ambassador, which is bringing all the African countries together to consider post-2015 development and what so the Millennium Development Goals are expiring in 2015. So the UN is looking at what's going to happen after 2015. So we were trying to get 60 ambassadors to sit in a circle, which was extremely difficult to do. Not used to it. They're not used to moving, actually, so they're all sitting there, and getting them to actually just stand up and move took half a day. Anyway, so we do things like that where we essentially help groups to come together that haven't really worked together on a short-term basis, as well as kind of doing multi-year efforts where we have groups of people that are working together on an issue over 2 years or 5 years or 3 years. There's lots and lots of material on our website if you obviously want to see more. There's case studies, there's documents, there's learning documents. In general, we do a lot of the stuff that you guys have done over the last 3.5 years, I guess. So we do a lot of learning journeys. We do a lot of internal work in terms of group dynamics, conflict resolution, and so on. So I guess just in terms of the techniques, there's kind of a lot in common in terms of what we do, which is why I guess you invited us to some extent, right? Any just questions on that? I mean, I can obviously talk about this as long as you want, but any kind of immediate questions? So preconditions are actually relatively simple for action. So we talk about 4 preconditions. If you imagine a triangle, one of them is just people. So have you got the right people in the room in terms of skill sets, but also stakeholders, people who really have a stake in the issue. And then one corner is resources. So do you have the right resources? And resources can mean political resources, but it can also mean social buy-in. You know, do the communities you want to work with want anything to do with you? Do they not really care? So do you have the social capital to actually do the work? And then the third corner of the triangle is essentially strategies. So, and by strategies, I don't mean a plan. What I mean is, do you have some sense of what direction you want to go in, given the issue that you're dealing with? And are you aware of what's already been done before and what's worked and what hasn't done, and you know who's tried what and how do people feel about what's being tried? So just some sense of what kind of what strategies you think might be useful to pursue. And then in the middle we talk about intention. So is there a shared intention among the people who are starting to do the work? You know, I kind of sometimes joke that if you have resources and people but no strategies, then you're the government. If you have no resources, you have people and strategies, then you're clearly an advocacy organization or a non-profit of some sort. So you can kind of see that, where these preconditions are missing, then you have particular challenges. And in almost all the cases that we work with, the preconditions are not in place. Something is missing from it. Either you don't have the right people in the sense that, there's a donor or a funder who wants to do something and they've come in from the outside and said, hey, I really want to fund this, but no one on the ground is actually interested in it. Or there's an organization that wants to do something, but no one else has bought into what they want to do. And, that can be quite extreme in some cases. So we've had, clients who come to us who are American or Canadian or wanting to do work in India or South Africa or whatever, and they haven't spoken to anyone who's Indian or South African, it's slightly problematic. So sometimes those preconditions be quite extreme in terms of not being in place, and sometimes they're kind of almost there but not quite there. And then obviously the intention piece is quite important in the sense that if we're bringing together really diverse groups of people to work in some sort of partnership and they don't have a shared intention or even a semblance of a shared intention, then that is a recipe for at least confusion, if not more than confusion. So that's kind of the preconditions piece. I can't remember a time where someone's come to us and said, hey, we want you to do a piece of work. By the way, we've got enough money, we've got enough people, we've got a clear intention, and we know what we want to do, but it just doesn't happen, right? So I've kind of started talking about the World Cup problem that, you get a phone call, someone says, we need your help. You say, well, what do you want to help with? And say, well, we want to win the World Cup. Or, we want to solve world hunger or the financial crisis or climate change, and we go, oh, that's great. So, what kind of resources do you have to win the World Cup? And they go, well, we don't have any money, and we can put one person on it a day a week, basically. And you go, well, you're not going to win the World Cup. And people go, well, why not? You're going to help us. You guys are experts at this stuff. You've been working at it for decades. We want you to help us win the World Cup. And you say, well, you got to have a team to actually play in the World Cup. Have you got a team? They're like, no, we don't have a team. Hey, maybe you can help us build a team. So there's often this kind of mismatch between people's aspirations, if you like, of, we want global peace, or we want, and the reality of, well, you need more than one person working a day a week to address this issue. So often the things we'll address is just this gap between kind of aspiration of, we want to solve world hunger, and it happens more often than you think. And often it's organizations, right? So, a big NGO or a big charity will call us up and basically say, we want to work on the sustainability of the food system. And we may be one of the largest non-profits in the world, but we've split up our efforts into 30,000 tiny little projects, and this is one of them, basically. So it's pretty rare that the preconditions are in place. So I mean, we talk about our work quite often as being systemic, and there's a particular way of kind of understanding systemic within our world, if you like. The simplest way, I guess, of explaining it is that if you imagine kind of all these issues that we're dealing with in terms of symptoms that we see, kind of people not getting on with each other, or people disagreeing with each other, or people being in conflict with each other, or carbon in the atmosphere increasing, or not being enough food for people, then the way we understand systemic is there's almost an engine that's driving those trends. There's a system, if you like, an engine that's driving these trends. And you can either deal with the trends or you can deal with the engine, right? So if people are hungry, you can feed hungry people without asking where they came from and how they're hungry. Or you could actually try and look at the root causes of the issues and basically say, well, what's the engine? What's the cause that's actually driving people to be hungry in the first place? And if we can address that, then we can stop people from being hungry. So that's I guess how we would understand systemic, and then we've evolved, I guess, a series of responses to how to do that work, which we can kind of get into. But the basic idea is that if you have more and more hungry people every year, and all you're doing is feeding hungry people, at some point you're going to fail, because there'll be too many people to feed, and the people who aren't getting fed there are going to be a lot more people not getting fed than people getting fed, and they're going to be a bit upset, basically. And I'll talk about that a little bit later in terms of how we do that. Yeah, so I mean that's the most common situation that so I mean it's just a matter of consciously building that, and also I mean Typically, when we start with a very small group of people. So usually there's one organization or 2 or 3 organizations that come to us and basically say that they want us to do something. So it's typically a small group of people. But even with that small group of people, I mean, it might just be a partnership between 2 organizations. They haven't had the conversation. You know, they just haven't sat down and said, well, you know, we're Oxfam or we're, you know, blah, and we're working with you guys and you're a private sector company. We have different intentions on what to do. We just need to talk about it. So sometimes it's actually extremely simple. It's just a matter of saying, well, have you talked about it? Oh, no, we haven't. Well, maybe we should talk about it, you know, and then you talk about it. And in other cases, it's much more complex where you sit and talk about it, but they're actually completely divergent, right? So people want completely different things. But we'll come to that. So when Mary called me and basically said that you guys have been through, or some of you have been through this 3.5-year program, and today was the last day, and you wanted me to come, my thought was, really? You want me to come in on like the last afternoon of a 3.5-year program? And I was thinking, what? You want someone from London to come to Belfast to talk about? So my initial reaction was was sort of like, I'm not sure how helpful I can be to this group. So I hope I can be helpful, and I hope I can be useful to you in some way. So I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about my background. So I obviously don't know Northern Ireland. I don't know the situation here. I don't know your reality. So I can't really speak to it. What I can do is speak to my reality. And if there's any resonance, then, you know, great. Otherwise, you know, what can we do? But I suspect there are some resonances. So I just want to tell you a little bit about my personal background. So this is my colonial history, if you like, right? So my grandparents are all from Calcutta, and they were immigrants to Calcutta. I don't know where they came from, but they migrated to Calcutta sort of in the early 1900s. And then in 1947, we had partition, where India was partitioned into India and Pakistan. And you had one of the largest mass migrations in history. Lots of people killed. So my grandparents moved from Calcutta to Chittagong, which is now in Bangladesh. And essentially, you know, we lost our home and house, and, you know, saw terrible things happen. And then the same thing happened again in 1971 when there was civil war in Pakistan and Bangladesh was created. So again, my parents and my grandparents left Chittagong and went to Karachi. And basically, again, similar situation, that there was lots of bloodshed and conflict, and they witnessed a lot of it personally. So my parents loved telling these stories of, you know, and then I saw this guy dragged from his house, and, you know, all these terrible stories that you don't really want to hear about in some ways. And then my parents moved to London in 72, and I was born in 73, so almost 40 years ago. And we were about 7 when we moved back to India. So my parents basically had this idea that they wanted us to experience some of the culture on the subcontinent and get out of Europe and the UK. I think they'd seen my other cousins growing up in London in the 70s and said, we don't want that to happen. So they basically, we just upped basically and left London and went to India. And we ended up in Delhi. And in 1984, so I don't know, how old was I? Probably 12 or 13. So one of my formative experiences was essentially being in Delhi when the Prime Minister was assassinated. And so she was assassinated by her bodyguards, who were Sikh. And we were at the embassy school at the time. So they basically locked down the school because there were all these Diplo brats basically at the school. And I remember my parents being kind of the first parents to kind of come to pick us up. And we drove home that day, basically seeing houses on fire. And essentially you had sort of 3 days of communal rioting where a lot of Sikhs were targeted by mobs, and they were dragged from their houses, and essentially 6,000 people were burnt alive on the streets. So one of my earliest memories was driving out after those 3 days where there was a curfew, and basically just seeing kind of all these burnt cars and petrol stations and houses on fire. We basically decided to leave India at that time. And one of the things I remember my parents saying is that we thought this place had changed, basically. That we thought things had changed in this time, but actually things haven't changed that much. And actually things are quite similar to, the feeling was quite similar to what had happened in the 40s and in the 70s. Which was kind of an interesting, and obviously we hadn't experienced what happened in the 40s and the 70s. So we moved to the Middle East and I lived in Abu Dhabi for 7 years. And we interestingly left Abu Dhabi because the Gulf War started.
You can see a pattern about
You see a
it.
pattern? It's not me, really.
Everywhere you go.
Everywhere I go. Everywhere I go. So we basically left Abu Dhabi '92, came back to London, and basically I've been living in London since then. But part of the question I've been asking is, how come? How does this happen, and how is it that it keeps happening, basically? And sort of the 90s were interesting also, just which led to kind of 9/11, and then being part of the Muslim community in the UK has been an interesting experience post 9/11, and there's been so I haven't really been that involved in the dynamics of the Muslim community, but I've kind of been on the receiving end and on witnessing a lot of the dynamics that have existed, particularly between the government and this community. And again, a lot of the dynamics that play out are shades of the dynamics that we've seen in the past. So a lot of my work has been just trying to figure out, how do we avoid these situations? How do we get into these situations? And what I've found, really, no matter where I work, is that the dynamics are very similar. So I've worked a lot in India, I've worked in South Africa, I've worked on Aboriginal issues in Canada and in the US, and essentially they're very similar kind of majority-minority dynamics or communal dynamics between Hindus and Muslims, or the white community in South Africa and the black communities in South Africa, and a lot of the dynamics are the same. And a lot of the questions people are asking are the same. That how do we recover? How do we build? How do we heal these kind of divisions that we have? What amazes me is that decades down the line you can still see these dynamics happening. So I was out of one eye kind of in Bangladesh. There are currently all these protests going on at the moment, and the protests are basically around people who were in the 70s during the Civil War had essentially committed crimes, essentially. So they were accused of war crimes. Now they've essentially 30, 40 years later, they're kind of leaders in their communities. And they've been trying to run these war tribunals and sort of take people to court for almost 40 years, and they've just managed to do it. So they basically took a bunch of people to court, found them guilty. People went crazy because these are now leaders of their communities. They're kind of in senior positions, and essentially what happened is they annulled some of the judgments, basically, which led to mass protests out in the street. So now there's massive protests going on with hundreds of thousands of young people out in the streets basically saying, just because you're a senior politician doesn't mean that you can escape the law. But what amazes me is sort of 40 years on, these dynamics are still kind of rumbling away. There are people on the streets, there are people dying on the streets, people getting shot on the streets because of these things that have happened 40 years ago. So obviously a lot of the questions you're all asking are non-trivial questions and are quite difficult. So I want to talk a little bit about personally how I kind of understand these kind of issues and my framing, if you like, for understanding these issues. So Mary had read, I guess, Adam's book, who's a colleague of mine, on power and love, and this question of power and love has obviously come up a lot in our work. So this is again, I stress to say this is kind of a personal framing, and my personal understanding of this. Is what I found kind of no matter where I go, is that it isn't that people are bad or people are evil or people wake up in the morning basically saying I'm going to go and harm somebody. What I tend to find is that people wake up in the morning championing a cause, and in the name of that cause lots of things can happen, basically. Lots of terrible things can happen essentially in the name of doing good, basically. The phrase that I've kind of found that captures that most clearly is the corruption of the best is the worst. So essentially what it is you're championing a cause, and in the name of that cause you can target another community. You can basically do it in the name of freedom, in the name of justice, in the name of something that's essentially inherently a good. I've never found people getting up in the morning basically saying, I just want to hurt somebody, or I just want to essentially destroy this community, or I want to do something that's bad. It's always in the name of something that's you can't argue with it, essentially. It's justice, it's peace, it's whatever it is. So it's not that you can argue with it. So part of my question has been, how do we end up in this situation where in the name of kind of, some of the best and most human qualities that we have, we end up sort of doing these horrible, tragic things. My kind of study of this and my readings of this I found that it's just endemic historically, that it happens all the time. The Soviet Union, if you like, was a dream of everyone being equal in society. In the name of that equality, you sacrifice millions of people. And these similar dynamics, I'm sure we can all kind of relate to. So one of the stories that I've read, which helped me kind of understand this phenomenon, if you like, is the story of the Good Samaritan, which I'm sure all of you know. So the story of the Samaritan is basically that he is traveling along a road and comes across a man that's been beaten and robbed and left lying in a ditch. And the man's basically lying in the ditch calling out for help, and people pass the man without helping him. And the reason they pass him without helping him is because he doesn't belong to their tribe, and they're not essentially, they don't know who he is, the man's a stranger. And then the Samaritan comes along, hears the cry of help, and essentially goes and helps the man, right? So that's kind of the story of the Good Samaritan. The question, of course, is why does he go help the man when it's acceptable culturally to walk past this man? So in the Bible, the story is that the Samaritan talks about being moved in his stomach by the cries of the man in the ditch, that he hears these cries, and he basically has a physical reaction to what he hears, and he goes and helps the stranger, right? And that leads to the possibility of helping the stranger. So now when we hear a stranger crying out for help, there is a requirement, if you like, to help the stranger, yeah? And that's early Christianity for you, and that's the message. One of the messages of the church is helping the stranger. And you know, there are these stories of early Christians who kept a bottle of water and a bed in their home for the stranger who would knock on their door, right? In order to give the stranger support. One of the kind of developments, if you like, of this story is how the church then picks up on this idea of helping the stranger, and essentially starts building an institution, if you like, that is dedicated to helping strangers, right? So we have the church developing hospitals, we have the development of education systems, and essentially the service industries, if you like, the helping industries, if you like, have all come, if you like, from this idea of helping the stranger. And what's happened is that in time that relationship has become professionalized. So instead of being moved by a physical response to helping the stranger, it's our job to help the stranger. We know we're all facilitators and helpers, and you know, we work in the caring professions, right? One of the results of that has been that that relationship between the people we're helping and us is essentially a non-physical, it's a disembodied relationship, right? So in the worst cases, if you like, it's a cost-benefit analysis, right? So you stand there and you basically go, okay, we've got limited budget, we've got limited resources, we've got limited time, we've got all these people who can help. Who are we going to help? We're not going to help you, we're going to help you, basically, right? So you essentially take a rational decision on who you want to help rather than an embodied decision on who you want to help. And obviously the embodied decision is unconditional, right? It's essentially someone's calling out for help. You don't ask who they are. You don't ask, you know, who they belong, what tribe they belong to. You go and help them, right? So part of my kind of assessment is that we've entered into this, if you like, disembodied relationship of helping, which means that we are necessarily forced by our donors, by whatever it is you want, by our profession to essentially help certain people and not help certain people. That's kind of part of the story for me, that we're sort of forced into these disembodied relationships with people. In terms of Adam's book, so my kind of interpretation is that we've kind of arrived at a situation where we're trying to use material resources to help people that we care about, if you like. We're trying to use money, power, status, whatever it is you want to call it, in order to help, quote, help people that are less well off or, you know, are in trouble, basically. Again, this is a very personal interpretation, but my interpretation of the corruption there is that we essentially we make a distinction between power and love, that love is one thing and power is one thing, and we essentially need to use power in order to support love, basically. So the claim of the church that, you know, we need money and we need resources in order to help people is part of, I think, the problem, that we're actually seeing these two things as completely separate. And one argument, if you like, is that they're actually not separate at all, that actually they're exactly the same thing, and it's where we separate them out that we actually get in trouble, basically, where we actually see the material, if you like, as being something that we have to amass in order to help other people. Then we get in trouble, because the focus then risks becoming the accumulation of more money or more resources or more power for the sake of helping people, but that relationship becomes essentially corrupted. So that's kind of one. So one answer, if you like, to a lot of the questions that you're asking, and I'm asking, and other people I know are asking, is that. So I guess all of you have heard this phrase, the power of the powerless, right? And I heard someone mention it at another table, right? So one answer is that essentially there is no difference between power and love, and actually what we're looking for is a form of radical powerlessness. That actually, the ultimate symbol of power in the Christian mythology is Christ on the cross, basically, which is in some ways the ultimate symbol of powerlessness. It's not a symbol of power to be crucified. It's the opposite in some ways. Yet at the same time, it is the ultimate symbol of power because it's managed to galvanize so many people to do what they do. So one of the answers that I struggle with and we struggle with in our work is basically this dichotomy between power and love. That in the material world, in the real world, they're often separated out, and one is called on to serve the other. But ultimately, I mean, what is it? It's actually about that it's entirely about the inner peace, if you like. It's entirely about your relationship in real terms, not in disembodied terms, to the people that you're working with, and what kind of relationship do you have, and how are you embodying that relationship with other people. And in some ways that makes it both extremely simple and extremely complex. So it's extremely simple in that it in some ways in our work we don't make a distinction between these external systems and ourselves, basically. So they're essentially the same thing, and in order to change these external systems, it's essentially all about what do we embody, what is our relationship to other people in the room, how do we treat people, how do we not treat people, which is simple in some ways, but obviously extremely complicated because of the type of world we live in, right? So that's part of my framing or my understanding of some of the challenges that we face. I read this really interesting book a while ago called Achilles in Vietnam, and it was basically about trauma in Vietnam and combat trauma in Vietnam, and it was written by a doctor, and he compared the practices of dealing with trauma in the Iliad versus what happened in Vietnam. And one of the things that he said, which I found really interesting, is that he talks about this experience of people in both the Iliad and in Vietnam essentially being betrayed by their superiors. So essentially having this experience of putting your trust into your leaders, whatever it is, essentially being betrayed by them. But the impact of that betrayal is that he uses the phrase that the shrinkage of your moral horizon. So you go from having a care for the wider whole or the wider community to essentially only being concerned with your immediate colleagues, if you like, or the people that are immediately around you. And he talks about this shrinkage of the horizon basically happening to, quote, the best of us. And he uses the example of Achilles, basically saying, he was somebody who was the best of the Greeks, if you like, and this shrinkage basically happens. So he experiences this betrayal, and essentially his concern goes from the wider whole to essentially just being concerned about one or two people around him. So I think that the trauma experience causes that shrinkage, if you like, where your intentions, if you like, in terms of good intentions, go from being concerned with the wider whole to essentially being concerned with your family or your community or whoever's closest to you. And obviously then we end up working in those situations, and that's a challenge. And of course it's a fight or flight response, right? So, when you're in a traumatic context or a conflict, we're all human beings, and we essentially have a fight or flight response. There are lots of different ways of how we deal with that or how we treat that. But I mean, it leads to kind of these horrible acts of brutality, if you like, right? Where if your concern has gone to just being about a very small group of people, then what do you do? And how do we, as practitioners, if you like, deal with that phenomena? In some ways, it's a very personal practice, and when we teach facilitation or kind of conflict resolution or mediation, at the end of kind of everything, after all the techniques, and you can do this, and you can do that, and you can learn this, and you can learn that. What we kind of teach is that it's kind of the keep calm and carry on thing. That it actually doesn't matter what is happening in the room, as long as you are calm and you can kind of keep going. That's all that really matters. And the minute you lose the plot, basically, because of what's happening in the room. And I had a really personal experience of this. I worked with one of my mentors is someone called Mona Lewis, and she basically teaches this thing called deep democracy, and it's essentially a form of conflict resolution, but it's also a form of provoking conflict. So when it's kind of under the surface, you essentially amplify it and bring it out into the room, and you have essentially a conflict in a constructive way. And I mean, there's a lot of it on the web, so you can have a look. But I remember having this experience with her 2006 maybe, when I was working in India, and she came and ran a session. There were probably 20 of us in the room, and it was for the staff of this initiative we were running, and it was around, we were working on child malnutrition. Anyway, I don't know how she got us there, but she basically got us into this space where people were talking about their own personal trauma and how they ended up in the helping professions, right? And how they ended up wanting to help other people. At one point, there was the youngest staff member on the team was a young Indian girl, and she basically started talking about how her father used to beat her, basically. And in the middle of talking about this, she just burst into tears and sort of crying and quite hysterically. And I remember kind of going, "Oh my God, what do you do now?" And so she's sitting on the other side of the room, sort of completely hysterical, in tears, and Myrna walks across to her and sits next to her. And then this guy sitting next to me just bursts into tears, and he's just like sobbing, and I'm looking at him and I put my arm around him, and then the other person sitting to my left burst into tears, and he's sobbing hysterically. And I remember at one point there were probably 2/3 of the room, and we were just out of it. They were just crying hysterically. And I remember looking at him with my eyes wide going, "What are you going to do? Now what are you going to do? And what are we supposed to do? All these people are just like..." And she didn't do anything. She basically just walked around the room and she spoke to people individually and spoke in their ears. I don't know what she said to them. And after about 20 minutes, everyone was fine. And I was kind of going, "Whoa, what was that about?" And and what amazed me was just her presence in that space, which is that it was fine. And afterwards, when I talked to this young girl who talked about her father beating her, she said to me, "Look, it's not my problem. You can't handle my emotions. I'm fine. Like, yes, I said all these things and I wanted to say all these things. Yes, I basically cried about it. But like, you're the person with the problem, not me, because you find it difficult to deal with my kind of emotional response." Like, yeah, that's a good point. So part of it, just to boil it down, is that's what I find kind of most useful. That it doesn't matter what kind of situation you're in, whether you're in a conflict, a physical conflict, any kind of a conflict, that if you've actually built the inner resources and the inner kind of, I guess, strength, or I don't know how you want to put it, resilience, to essentially be able to stay calm in those situations and not get rattled, that goes a long way, I find. I don't know if other people have that. And that's a rather simplistic answer in some ways, because obviously if you're in a situation where there's actual real conflict and real threat of kind of violence and so on, then you do tend to go into a fight or flight response yourself. So how, again, do you avoid that response?